All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast here on Bolt Breakdowns. Here with Daniel Popper of The Athletic. As always, a pleasure to have him on this channel. So I just want to start by congratulating you on finishing another season of Chargers beat reporting. I'm sure it was not easy this year. So I guess from, wherever you want to start, what was this season, I guess, like for you?
Whew. Yeah, where to start? I think as a reporter, you're just sort of assessing objectively like what's happening. But naturally, you head into the season with certain expectations. I had a pretty good sense heading into the season that there were high expectations for this team. Now, what specifically were those expectations? I can't nail that down exactly, but I knew they needed to win. I knew they needed to probably win a playoff game. I knew that they needed to contend for the AFC West. Like they had to be sort of a legitimate team as far as contending for the Super Bowl. And so, as the season progressed, you just got the sense that the team was not there. And I think you can sort of go back to the start of the season, right? That Miami game, I think there was a lot of excitement internally about the defense finally coalescing. And I think that first game against Miami at SoFi was a really good indication that this team wasn't anywhere close to that, the way they got burned by that offense. Now, obviously, like through the first half of the season, that offense was operating at a historic rate and like nobody could stop them. They put up 70 on the Broncos, right? Then in Tennessee, right? Like some of the similar, breakdowns, not as frequent, but you had two big explosive passes in that game that sort of led to them losing to a quarterback that eventually lost his job. And so, as the season sort of progressed, you get the sense that, the defense isn't where anyone expected it to be. The run game is nowhere close to, what they expected it to be. And as these close losses sort of mounted, you really got a sense that this wasn't anywhere close to what the Chargers expected. Now, should they have acted differently in the offseason? Should they have taken maybe a different approach to, their assessment of the roster? Probably. I mean, I'm sure you were reading me, Alex. I'm sure people watching this were reading me. Like I wasn't as high on this roster as a lot of people were. I predicted 9-8 in May. I was obviously everyone was off, but I was probably closer than most people, because I had concerns. I think every time I come onto this show, like I talk about the tight end blocking and people are sick of it, but like it was a factor in how the run game operated. I had concerns about safety depth. I had concerns about corner depth. I didn't see a roster that was close to contending to the point where it made sense for them to restructure all of those deals and really, go all in for this season. And I think a lot of those weaknesses kind of popped up. And I'm going long-winded here, but it was a very open-ended question. Like I think, that game in Green Bay was really like, I go back to that game as sort of, and I think I wrote this in my sort of breakdown of the season, what went wrong in the Staley era. That to me was really like the beginning of the end. I mean, obviously you had the drops in that game. You had Keenan Allen dropping a touchdown. You had Parham drop the fourth down. You had the Quentin drop, right? But like, to me, the story of the game was the defense just unraveling yet again. At that point, Jordan Love was teetering. Like, I don't think anyone really thought that he was the guy that he is now. Like, if you look at a point of demarcation in his season and maybe in his career, like it could be that game. Like that game built a ton of confidence in him. And it wasn't necessarily like he was making these great throws in that 2-minute drive. You had the Dontavian Wicks, missed tackle. Michael Davis and Eric Kendricks run into each other. That goes for 35 yards. And then you have a defense that can't get set up in the red zone. And there's the Romeo Doubs touchdown for the lead. And then you just felt the frustration from Brandon Staley after that game, almost unwilling to admit that his defense was the reason that they lost, really trying to pin it all on the drops, really. And then, you get to a point where, Justin Herbert gets injured in that Broncos game. And then, I think we all saw, the end in Vegas. I don't think anyone had any doubts. I think at that point, like the decision had probably been made. I think ownership wanted to wait until after the season to make any sort of move. It's how they've always operated. But that kind of embarrassment in a national spotlight, trailing 63-7 to your division rival with a rookie quarterback. It's just unacceptable. And I think at that point there was no real value in keeping this thing together. So I think that the weaknesses were there if you wanted to look for them. But under no circumstances with the talent that they have should it have ever gotten as bad as it did in Vegas, and it should not have gotten to 5-12.
Yeah, I think throughout the season we just saw this. I saw the Kevin Gilbride stat every week. It's like, okay, well, the Chargers aren't going to make a midseason change. They haven't done this since then. They let Lynn be 3-9 and work his way back to 7-9. But yeah, after the Raiders game, I think that was curtains closing, unfortunately. And like you said, I think there was just this feeling every week that like they should beat this team, right? Based on our preseason expectations and even like what we thought maybe in those first 5-6 games. But then when it just continuously kind of not kept coming together on the Chargers' own terms, like the Green Bay game and that unraveling, I keep seeing PFF post stats every week that's like, oh, Jordan Love has thrown 400 touchdowns and 10 interceptions since week 11. And I'm like, oh, who did Jordan Love play in week 11? So
There's
that's
something
just
there.
kind of,
There's something there.
yeah,
Like a lot of it with
absolutely.
quarterbacking in the NFL with young guys is about confidence. Like I'm not going to say that the reason he's good is
Right.
that game, but
Yeah.
like there's something to like, leading a 2-minute drive, go ahead touchdown, that can really galvanize an individual and give them the confidence to go perform. Like I genuinely think something's there. And I'll tell you, like Chargers players in the locker room thought the same thing. I had players talk to me about that. Like, do you think that Jordan Love's playing this way because of what happened in Green Bay? And I was like, maybe. Like it's these guys are human beings, right? Like,
Right.
that kind of confidence from a specific moment or a specific game can spur a guy.
Yeah. And, Love obviously didn't play a whole lot in these first, years that he's been drafted. And so just to have that moment probably did fuel him a bit. I guess what were your interactions like with Brandon Staley as kind of the weeks progressed, and what were you what was the point, I guess, for you where, you point out the Raiders game specifically, but when this kind of all just became, unsalvageable in your estimation, if you had
Yeah.
to pinpoint a specific moment.
Yeah. I don't think our relationship was like as bad as maybe people on the outside thought.
Right.
Like we were always cordial, and like,
Mhm.
he understands that it's part of the job. But I would go like the place I went to when I was like the day it happened was that press conference in the Green Bay game, and where he said like, I have confidence that the game plans that we put together every week are giving us a chance to win. And that really like got to the core of what was wrong with the whole Brandon Staley era. Just a lack of accountability, I think, is the best way to frame it. Like anyone, regardless of how much you know about football, could watch this team over the last 3 years and identify the defense as a big problem. This defense was never good at any point. I mean, maybe the 4-game stretch that led them into the playoffs in 2022, but like go look at the quarterbacks they were playing. Like there was one game where they really had an outstanding performance, and that was against the Dolphins in that Week 14 game. The other quarterbacks, you're talking about Nick Foles, you're talking about Ryan Tannehill on one leg, you're talking about Baker Mayfield off the what was that, his second game with the Rams,
Yeah.
right? So I think that quote, that moment to me was really like, I think at that point I was like, this is probably not the guy, and this is probably not going to continue after this season, because, as a coach, you can stand up there and say that your game plans are good, but it's also your job, and I would say like your priority, to make sure that those game plans are being translated in a way to your players where they can go out and execute it. And there was a disconnect there, between how Brandon Staley wanted to play, how complex he wanted these plans to be, and what the players felt like they were capable of doing. I think Derwin James is probably the best example of that. Like I think in a vacuum, like Derwin playing 6 positions and calling the defense in the huddle sounds great, but like he's also a human being, and like the more you put on his plate, the more you're going to slow him down. And I think we all saw that this year. Again,
Yeah.
like you don't need to be like a football genius to see that, like, hey, Well, we saw this guy play in 2018. He was an all-pro in a much more simplistic defense. And that guy this year was not at that level. And it's like, well, how much of it is what they're putting on his plate? It's like, okay, well, on one snap, play safety. And now you're playing downhill. Everything is in front of you. The next snap, you're playing star, where your angles are completely different and how you're covering things are completely different. It might even be the same call. You might be playing cover 3 on both of them, but you're doing very different things and taking very different angles on both of them. The next play, you're playing money. The next play, you're not even in coverage. You're blitzing. And it's like, and like early on in the tenure, it's like, and I want you to be signaling, all the plays in the huddle. And it's like, yeah, like on a whiteboard, this is going to cause a ton of confusion for opposing quarterbacks, right? Like they're going to have to identify Derwin on every single snap, but it's like, what kind of effect is this having on Derwin? And that's like the best example I can come up with in terms of like the disconnect there. Yeah, X's and O's wise, this is a good way to go about things, but is this the best for the player? Is this how to get the most, out of the player? And I think all along, especially with the secondary, like I think they wanted to play fast and they felt like they couldn't play fast with just how much was going on in the game plans during the week and then on game day. And I think you saw them simplify everything, right? Like I think that was a big thing with GIF and DA after Staley got fired, was like you saw, let's keep the example with Derwin, like he was basically playing one position in each game. It was like if he was playing safety, he was playing safety. If he was playing star, he was playing star. And you saw a player that was playing faster. You saw a player that was much more confident, right? And I think, going back to that Green Bay press conference, you're like, well, he won't take accountability for the fact that like maybe some of this is on him. Maybe the game plan is good, but it's also his job to distill this to the players. And that disconnect really, I think, shone through in that moment. And that was the biggest issue to me defensively for the Chargers under Brandon Staley.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Derwin, and I think he ended up his final 2 games where they basically simplified his role. He had 2 of his best performances, by PFF, by the film, as it was graded this year. And I just think that signals what you were talking about, obviously. And going back to that press conference, not to harp on it too much, but Quentin Johnson obviously has the drop at that end of the game, and Brandon Staley is in an attempt to defend Quentin Johnson, talking about what he did in minicamp, right?
Yeah,
and
can I clarify this, because I feel like this got misconstrued a little bit by the fan base. I brought up training camp, because in the question I was saying like,
right,
we've seen this since training camp, like, and I didn't write or talk about this that much, but Quentin Johnson was dropping a ton of balls, and that was not just in 7-on-7, 11-on-11. If you sat there and watched, routes against air with the receivers, he was dropping balls there. Like to me, it always felt like a concentration issue with him. And so I was sort of hearkening back to that, saying like, hey, like we've seen this since then. Like, is this an issue that's correctable? Like, is this just who he is? Like, how do you get him to concentrate? Because in the locker room after the game, he admitted like it was just a lack of concentration. So then Staley brought up training camp because I brought up training camp. So he said, well, he also made a lot of plays in training camp, which is true, and I think he was agitated. And so he said like, well, you were there at training camp. You saw him make plays, like as a reporter, like you should know, so that's really what happened. I didn't really think too much of it. I thought that kind of got blown out of proportion, and I don't think people actually heard my question. So like, I'll take responsibility there. I brought up training camp. In these press conferences, like I feel like a lot gets made of like the questions that get asked. Like I'm not saying that 100% of the time I'm going to articulate my questions perfectly. Like I do my best. I try, but you're on the spot there. You're talking extemporaneously. And like, sometimes you don't ask a great question. I thought it was a fine question. I thought it was fine that he brought up training camp. Like, I think training camp is relevant, right? Because like, that's where you're really like building your team, is during those practices in the summer. Obviously things change, but that's sort of the context there. I hope that helps people and makes it a little bit clearer about why that came up in the press conference.
No, yeah, 100%. It definitely makes sense. I just think, and not that Staley ever has to speak to the fan base or speak to, I guess, he does have to speak to ownership, but it is kind of just like the point in the season we're in versus the point in the season we were in then, right? And so I do think that kind of did miss the mark to some extent. But yeah, moving past, I guess, this season, since we are in off-season mode, what do you think, I guess, of the Chargers head coaching GM search and where it is now? I think there's been a lot made about, you know, Diana Rossini apparently had a report in The Athletic that the Chargers could be looking to avoid a first-time head coaching hire. A lot has been made of Jim Harbaugh, who you wrote about today in a great article that you should check out over on The Athletic. And so I guess putting all of these snippets and bits that we've heard from, Rappaport and Pelissero and Rossini and all these sources, like, where do you kind of think the Chargers head coaching search and GM search is right now?
Yeah, I think, you look at sort of the history of this, right? And we can start there because you brought up the sort of the idea of experience or previous head coaching experience. The most successful seasons this century for the Chargers have come with head coaches who've had previous experience as head coaches and success as head coaches. You go to the Marty Schottenheimer years and the Norv Turner years. Those have been by far the most successful runs for the Chargers. They have not hired a coach with previous experience since Norv Turner. Go Mike McCoy, Anthony Lynn, and then Brandon Staley, obviously. And so, I think experience will be valuable. I mean, John Spanos, president of football operations, said that pretty explicitly to us a month ago, where he was like, it's going to be an added benefit. I think experience is a good thing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, do I think that means they're definitely going to hire a coach with previous head coaching experience? No, but like you look at the top candidates out there, and I think like this offseason is pretty unique in the sense that there are a lot of really good candidates with previous head coaching experience. And it's not just Jim Harbaugh, right? Dan Quinn has previous head coaching experience. Mike Vrabel has previous head coaching experience. Bill Belichick has obviously previous head coaching experience. Pete Carroll has previous head coaching experience. So if you want us to go in that direction, this is a very good offseason to sort of do that. I don't necessarily think that they definitely will. Like, I still consider Ben Johnson to be like a tier 1 candidate for them. I think the way the Lions played in that game against the Chargers at SoFi Stadium really raised some eyebrows. And I wrote about that. I did a film breakdown of that game about how Ben Johnson just felt one step ahead of Brandon Staley throughout that game. So I think right now it's still relatively early. I think like with the way the guidelines are set up, the NFL is trying to slow this whole thing down. So they can't even do in-person interviews until after the divisional round with anybody that's employed by an NFL team. Now, obviously, Jim Harbaugh doesn't fall into that boat because he's employed by a college. Now, in order to make any sort of hire, though, like you do have to comply with the Rooney Rule, which means 2 in-person interviews with either minority candidates or women. And so like that's sort of part of this too in terms of the timeline. I wrote about that today. So I think ultimately they're casting a wide net. Like I really believe that. Like they are going to do their due diligence. I don't think they're going to fall in love with a candidate and not really interview as many candidates as they really want to. The interesting component of it all is like, how do they want the power structure to work out? I get the sense that they do want to move away from sort of that the GM that runs everything about the football operations, because they did that for 11 years under Tom Telesco. Tom Telesco is a Bill Polian guy. That's how Bill Polian ran it in Indianapolis, and that's how Tom Telesco ran it with the Chargers. And so I think, when they talk about reimagining, I think in their mind, they would create a different type of power structure where instead of GM coach, it's GM coach side by side, both reporting to ownership, something like that. Just as an example, I'm not saying that's definitely what they're going to do, but I think they look at what happened with the Lions. Like, I think that is the model that is very attractive to them, right? They went out and they got what turned out to be a great leader in Dan Campbell. They paired him with Brad Holmes. They hired them at the same time, and then tried to really create like a very collaborative environment. And I think ultimately that's what they want. Now, can that happen? Well, depends on what head coach you hire, right? Like I think, and there's so many factors at play here. But if you go after certain head coaching candidates, like there will be, an expectation on their end that they have some personnel control, final say, right of first refusal, whatever it is. In that case, how do you pair them with a GM? How do you set up the power structure so that the head coach isn't taking on too much responsibility? What I can say is, like, I don't think the Chargers, from an ownership standpoint, really believe in giving the head coach that much power. I don't think they believe that, like a Bill Belichick model, for example, where he's head coach and de facto GM. I think they believe that's too much responsibility for one person. And so, like, if you do go get a Jim Harbaugh, I kind of explored that today in my article. Like, what does the power structure look like? How can you create, maybe sort of an even power structure? The problem is, like, ultimately it comes down to one thing, right? Like, you can try to create an even power structure, but whichever of those two people has final say over personnel is going to have the upper hand in the relationship. And so like you're trying to find two people that can work together, that are willing to work together, and where there isn't going to be some sort of friction between those two people. I think ultimately that's what they're looking for. And I think what the model that they're really trying to target would be more close to like what the Lions have built in Detroit.
Yeah, and I think it's a fine line to walk too, because you go to something like Las Vegas a couple years ago with Gruden and Mayock, where Gruden obviously is the $100 million man, Mayock is the GM, but from all reporting there, it felt like Gruden certainly had final say, mostly on all
Yeah.
of those matters, and so is that something that you want to repeat with, not repeat for the Chargers, but give to Belichick, give to Harbaugh? And all of those candidates, I think, is going to be a big part of this. And then, what is kind of, I guess, what do you think about John Spanos in terms of like what his role would sort of like be in this, reorganization of the power structure if, say, they were to go hire, the next, head coach?
Yeah. No, I get the sense that John Spanos is moving more towards an ownership role and moving away from, this president of football operations, which is his title. Obviously, Dean Spanos is getting older. Like I don't think, he's going to continue to be like that day-to-day operations owner that he's been. Like so there'll be transition here in the coming years as far as like, okay, who's representing the Chargers at owners meetings, like who's in the room for these things, like that type of stuff. And as John Spanos takes on more of that, right, he's going to be less involved in like the real day-to-day of the football operations. And so I think that's really where it's headed. And so like whoever they do hire, whoever, as GM is going to have a lot of responsibility, just like Tom Telesco did. And so like I don't get the sense that moving forward, that John Spanos is going to be like extremely involved in football operations. He's going to be there, right? Like that's just how they believe an ownership group should be run. They believe in being involved, but I think you're going to see him transition closer into, a full-time ownership role, and the responsibilities that come with that versus, being really, really involved in sort of the football operations side of things.
Also, speaking of football operations, I guess, how desirable is this job? Because that's obviously, debate that comes up, because obviously a lot of the national media members will, mention Justin Herbert, but they also have that cap situation to figure out. And obviously now are dealing with the aftermath of the restructures and the final years of Staley and Telesco's, kind of work here. So I guess, do you think that would like truly impact, this search in terms of, finding a head coach who maybe is willing to, I guess, kind of take a reset year, so to speak, with this roster? Or is that kind of overblown and, Justin Herbert still kind of is the main attraction?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. How I would frame it is like the upside of Justin Herbert far outweighs the downside of
Yeah.
any sort of cap situation. Like we talk a lot about the cap, but like
Yeah.
it's relatively easy to like work through these problems. Like it's not like the Chargers are getting to this point and being like, oh my God, like we have, 142 million in cap tied up in Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Joey Bosa, and Khalil Mack. Like, no, it's been that way. Like they've known this was coming since they did the restructures in March of last year. And so they've had a plan, right? Like I think, there is a reality to it though, as you alluded to, where like whoever does come in here is going to have to make some hard decisions. I think the best route is to just rip the Band-Aid off and, try and get value for whoever you can on the trade market, and where whatever dead money is necessary in 2024. You have the 5th pick this year. If you come away with a good draft class in 24, then you can really start building this thing into 25. If you get a good coach in here, there's a chance that they can, be in the mix, next year. I don't think that's completely out of the question. Like when you have the quarterback, anything's possible. And so because of that, I find the job very attractive. I think a lot of people in the league find the job very attractive because, it's not often that you get a job like this that opens up where you have a guy that, in my opinion, is like 100% no doubt a top 10 quarterback in the league and probably like a top 7 quarterback in the league and has the capabilities of being like a top 3 guy in the league. with the right coaching, with the right personnel. And so, like, I think the job is very attractive. I think it's the most attractive job in the league right now. And I think it's one of the most attractive openings in recent history just because of Justin Herbert. And I don't think there needs to be like any more analysis than that. Like when you have a guy that's that good, that's capable of those things, like it makes the potential of a turnaround much faster. And they can negotiate through this cap situation. They have options, right? Like you can, what I would do is rip the Band-Aid off. I would not hire a single GM that didn't agree to that organizational process. And I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. But there are options. Like if you hire a GM / coach that, thinks Keenan Allen is going to be a piece of this thing, you can extend him. If they feel like Khalil Mack has, 2 more years of quality play, which is like not out of the question at this point after the season that he had, you could extend him as well. Mike Williams, probably not going to extend him just because of the injury. And then, Joey Bosa obviously coming off two injury plague seasons as well. So like there are options. Like you can keep some of them. I think a scenario where you keep all 4 is out of the question. But the cap situation, like that's why these guys get paid. Like it's not, if I can look at it, I'm sure you've looked at it. If you can figure out a path forward, then they certainly can. And it's not like this is being dumped on their plate right now. They've known that this was the reality for a year, basically, since they made the moves last year. And Justin Herbert is an extremely attractive piece to coach. And I think that's the primary reason why it's an attractive job. And I think it outweighs any cap concerns.
Just to clarify, when you say rip the Band-Aid off, you're talking about getting rid of all 4 of the restructured guys, whether that's through cuts and trades or, some combination.
I have an article coming out Tuesday morning. So I'll leave the tease there. I'll leave the tease there, and you can find out what ripping the Band-Aid off means Tuesday morning on theathletic.com/team/Chargers. How about that?
That's a good plug. I guess because we talked about, I remember you were on after the Jags lost last year, and we talked about Keenan, and Keenan was one of those guys where we even kind of debated, like, would last year have been the year to potentially have moved off of Keenan? And obviously then he has this career season where he is top 5 in receiving yards, and he didn't even play, the last 4 or so games. And so I'm just kind of interested because obviously he's a huge piece of what they've done with Herbert and their connection, but also, pivoting to the future, do you kind of, like you said, rip the Band-Aid off there? No, I can't. I remember
the conversation, Alex, because you asked me for a percentage, and I said percentage chances that Keenan was going to be on the team next year. I said 37%. I didn't say 0%. I said 37%, which means effectively rounding up 4 out of every 10 permutations of reality. Keenan Allen is on the Chargers, and this happened to be.
I am not the statistically illiterate one. Twitter and Reddit are the statistically illiterate people.
No, I'm not absolving myself. I thought, like, listen, I looked at it and I said, like, this makes the most sense. Like, and that was, part of that was how I felt about the roster, right? Like, I didn't think this was a roster capable of contending this season. I just didn't. And so I felt like to set themselves up for a better reality in 2024, they had to at least consider doing that. Because now, guess what? He has a $36 million cap hit, and they ended up doing all these restructures. But the reason they're in this situation now, where they're probably going to have to lose a season of Justin Herbert at 26, is because they didn't do what I said last offseason. And this has nothing to do with Keenan as a player. Like, I didn't think that Keenan was going to come back and have a bad season.
Right.
Like, he's a really good player, but these are the tough decisions that you have to make so that you don't end up in cap hell. And, if they'd made different decisions last offseason, they wouldn't be in a situation now, whether it was the same coach or a different coach, or same GM or a different GM, where they now have to wear $50 to $70 million in dead money, depending on what decisions they make. Like, that's not a way to build a roster. They're in this situation because of the decisions they made last year. So for me, it was all a financial thing. It had nothing to do with the quality of the player. It was how do you set yourself up for financial success so that you can build a competitive roster in 2024? That's going to be really, really difficult with the decisions that they have to make here. And on top of that, what I don't think anyone saw coming was the fact that they're going to have to wear $20 million for JC Jackson. I don't think we were expecting that $20 million to be paid to JC Jackson so he could go perform as a cornerback, not so he could, end up wherever he's going to end up. So that's the explanation.
Yeah, no, and obviously Chargers might have read your article over in The Athletic and said, no, we're doubling down. Which is maybe what happened last year.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of, getting into more specifically the head coaching and GM candidates, let's start with the big one in Jim Harbaugh. Um, what is your kind of read, I guess, on, is he leaving? Is he staying? And, I guess how you think he fits within this Chargers organization.
Yeah. Like I think he's a candidate. I think he's a tier 1 candidate, but I don't think he's like a leading candidate or anything like that. I think it's too early in the process to say anything like that. I find him very intriguing as far as a fit for the team. I think like I had a lot of conversations with players. I think I wrote about this in my story today. Like I had a lot of conversations with players about like, what are you looking for? Like what needs to happen in here? And conversations with coaches as well. Like what needs to happen here? Like for like, what do you think? What traits do you think are important? And like a lot of guys just talked about like, there needs to be more accountability. So like exactly what we were talking about before. Like there needs to be somebody who comes in here who has a proven ability to hold people accountable, to hold the organization accountable, to hold the players, the coaches, everyone accountable, and to establish that level of accountability for everyone, and not differentiating based on anything, contract, star player, etc. And I think, so those are sort of the traits that I'm thinking about. I also get the sense that the players that are returning like are eager for somebody like that. Like I don't necessarily think they want like a dictator, but I think if the Chargers were to make a move for somebody who, is notorious for having sort of a tough leadership style, like I don't think that would be a negative for the locker room. I think players would be open to that, particularly if the person that they bring in, has cachet, has proved that he can win, right? Now that could apply to a number of different candidates, right? I think that definitely applies to Jim Harbaugh. I think there's value in having a pre-existing relationship with ownership. He's not coming in blind as far as how the organization is run because he played here for 2 years. And so like, I find him intriguing. Right. And we'll sort of see like what has been, obvious for the last 2 years is that, he's wanted to leave. Now, like he's maybe a better way to phrase it is he's considered it, right? Like he full-fledged interviewed for the Vikings job 2 years ago. They offered it to Kevin O'Connell, but like he was in that building and there was a chance that it was going to happen. He discussed
and the Denver job.
Right. Exactly. Last offseason, he discussed the Denver job. So it's not like this is some foreign concept. Like, and I think like, and this is me just speculating, like I don't have anything on this, but like, you look at it and you say, okay, like, he won a national championship this year. Like he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish at Michigan. And so, what's left on his list of things to accomplish as a football coach,
Right.
The obvious one is winning a Super Bowl. What team is going to give him the best opportunity to do that? Like we said, like what's the most attractive job? What's the fastest path to winning ball games? And Justin Herbert presents that. So I think the marriage makes sense. Like, do I think it's going to happen? I don't know. We'll see. Like, I honestly think they are doing like a legitimate, like far-reaching, wide-reaching search. Like, and I think they're open to all possibilities, right? Whether that's hiring the GM first and then bringing in a coach, or hiring them simultaneously, or hiring a coach and giving him personnel control, or different power structures. Like, I think they're really assessing everything. Like, I genuinely believe that. He is, to me, a candidate in the mix. To me, an intriguing candidate, and certainly a possibility.
Yeah. Obviously, the interesting thing to me there is like, I think we talked about the desire to finish the job and win the Super Bowl, but there also is this looming specter for him. It was like, is the NCAA like still gonna be a thorn in his side? And if they potentially suspend him again for impending violations, or that
Yeah.
I feel like that probably would test how much of a Michigan man he wants to be.
Right.
And obviously
there's also the question of like, is the NFL even a safe harbor? Right. Like I think
right. Yeah, I think
that like
Rappaport,
that
put
the
that out.
NFL might like honor the suspension. When the time comes, if I need to, I will be diving into like NCAA statutes to like figure out exactly, or like talking to legal experts to figure out if that's even like allowed. But yeah, like all of that is a part of the calculus here. But yeah, like again, a candidate, an interesting one, and we'll sort of see how it plays out.
Outside of Harbaugh, who are maybe two or three of the other, if you have them in your tier one or maybe beginning of tier two, like type candidates for this job?
Yeah, I'll throw a few out. I think Dan Quinn is really interesting. Now, the buzz is that with Pete Carroll gone,
Seattle.
right, that would make sense. But there's also a possibility that Seattle would say, well, we've had Pete Carroll here for however long it was, 15 seasons or whatever it was, like, bringing in somebody that coordinated under him that, is that really like the departure that we want? Like, do we want to try something new? But he's really interesting to me. Ben Johnson, obviously, I don't know if we talked about him yet, but I think I mentioned that 41-point showing at SoFi, was a real thing. But with him, there are the drawbacks about experience, and do you want to commit to another inexperienced coach? I think that they should absolutely kick the tires on Bill Belichick. I think the guy can still coach. I think his downfall in New England was more personnel related than anything else. Um, if I was running the show, I would be interviewing Mike Vrabel like tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like that, he's one of like 3 coaches in the NFL, four coaches in the NFL that I can say firmly is like 100% a good coach.
Yeah, I still don't fully understand what happened in Tennessee, because then you have the owner there releasing statements that was just like, well, it would have
Yeah,
taken a little too long to trade him. And then I'm like, what?
yeah, yeah.
In
I'm
terms of
with
how
you on that.
that
But it's
in
like it's
terms
like
of that.
him, John Harbaugh, Mike Tomlin, Andy Reid.
Yeah.
Who else? Like I put him in that class.
Mhm.
The way he's able to win games, with the rosters. I mean, it took Ryan Tannehill to an AFC Championship game. Like, and I
Yep.
think like from an accountability standpoint, like he fits that mold to a T, right? So those are the guys. Um, you know, moving into tier 2, like Steve Wilkes is a really interesting candidate to me. Never felt like he really got a fair shake in Arizona when they moved on from him to go get Cliff Kingsbury.
Yeah.
In Carolina as the interim, like you hear a lot of good things about sort of, what he did in that role. He has that type of personality, leader of men, accountability, that kind of stuff that we're talking about. So he would be an interesting guy. You look at what Todd Monken's done with the Ravens. That's an interesting candidate. So yeah, those are some of the names. Like, but I think like if they do want to go in the direction of like head coach with previous success, like there are like elite candidates there that we've just discussed that I think make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing will be, I guess, kind of the timeline. And obviously, the NFL's pushed everything back, but like, with Jim Harbaugh kind of blooming, and then it's like, okay, well, we can't talk to, Ben Johnson potentially until after the divisional round, obviously, and a lot of these NFL guys who are in the playoffs until after then. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens there. Um, GM candidates, I feel like we're, on Twitter and, everything a little bit more well versed on the head coaching candidates than we are maybe the GM guys. But, in terms of the interviews and requests that they have so far, ones they may add, who sticks out to you there?
Yeah, so I have the list right here that I put together. So requests that have been leaked so far, or the Chargers have announced. So Jeff Ireland, who's a Saints assistant GM, Terrence Gray, who's Bills director of player personnel, Brandon Brown, Giants assistant GM, who they announced they interviewed today or yesterday. I don't know. Everything blends together.
They interviewed him
Today. Adam Peters, 49ers assistant GM, Ian Cunningham, Bears assistant GM, Jeff King, Bears co-director of player personnel, Will McClay, Cowboys VP of player personnel, and then they interviewed JoJo Wooden. Obviously you have to be interested in Adam Peters considering the rosters that they built in San Francisco. I think what you're looking for is like, okay, which organizations have been able to sustain success? And that's really where you're looking, right? And that's where you'll see a lot of these candidates from. Now, not necessarily the team they're on right now, but where they've been in the past.
right.
So, you look there because of what the 49ers have been able to build. Will McClay is a really interesting candidate to me. Not technically like an assistant GM, but he's, the head personnel guy underneath the Jones family. And obviously the way the Cowboys have drafted, I mean, like that sometimes I feel like it's overlooked a little bit, but they've been like, to me, like maybe a top 5 drafting team of the last decade.
Yeah.
And then, Ian Cunningham, obviously, they have a request out there for him. He is reportedly a finalist for the Commanders job. But the one thing that I would point out with him is he spent 9 seasons as a scout with the Ravens. And so like that's really what you're looking for, right? Like you're not saying like, oh, what has he done with the Bears? It's like, well, where did he come up? How did he learn the ropes of like what a front office is supposed to look like? And like if there is one, kind of shining example of like what a front office should look like the Ravens are that, right? Like they've been just perennially very, very good. Ozzie Newsome now more in a VP role, but anyone that sort of worked and come up under Ozzie Newsome, I think should be really intriguing. And so, the interesting thing there is like if they do hire Jim Harbaugh, I think I wrote about this today, like, keep an eye on sort of the Ravens ties, because, everyone thinks back to sort of like, okay, who was there with him in San Francisco in like 2011 to 2014? But obviously his brother coaches the Ravens and there are relationships there. So Ian Cunningham is interesting in that sense because he spent the majority of his, especially the early stages of his career, got hired in Baltimore in 2008 and spent 9 seasons there. And then some guys that have not necessarily been requested yet, or like it hasn't leaked yet.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Ortiz with the Ravens. He is their assistant GM or director of player personnel. I can't remember, but another guy with Ravens ties who could be an interesting fit with Harbaugh or just an interesting fit in general. And then Trey Brown, who's a senior personnel director for the Bengals, is really interesting. Worked for the Eagles when they won a Super Bowl. Was a scout with the Patriots. And then he left the Eagles to, take a GM job in both the AAF and the XFL, so he could learn how to run the show himself. And then got back on board in the NFL with the Bengals in 2021. I think we've all seen what they've been able to build there. Obviously almost making the playoffs with Jake Browning. So those are some names I throw out. I wouldn't be surprised if, we see a Joe Ortiz request or a Trey Brown request in the coming days. But it's going to be interesting to see what direction they go with this and how they sort of morph it and mold it. Ultimately what you're looking for is that collaborative environment. And, whoever you're hiring as GM, you want them to be on the same page with the coach and really have that kind of symbiotic relationship, have that kind of that rhythm, that connection. I think, during the Staley era, I got the sense that was sort of missing. Despite the fact that there was collaboration, I don't think that there was that connection there that you really need between those two very important people in your football operations.
Okay. I promise I won't post this one on Twitter this time. Gun to your head, who's the head coach?
Oh. I don't want to answer this question, Alex.
You can abstain if you want. I will allow you to abstain from the question if you want to.
Well, how about this? Since I gave you 37% last year, this year I'm going to abstain. And I'll just say that there will be a head coach and there will be a GM. How about that? Strong take.
That's a fair answer. I deserve that for what I did.
I'm not getting buried on Twitter again. I will not. I'm giving myself an out.
It's been great having you on, Daniel, man. Thanks for coming on. Anything you want to let the people know about what you're working on over at The Athletic these next couple weeks and months of this long off season?
Yeah. So we'll have the GM search and head coaching search covered. Like I mentioned earlier, Tuesday morning, I will have my 10-step plan for how I would approach dealing with the roster and the cap situation. So keep an eye out for that. That's my next big thing coming.
All right. Thanks to Daniel Popper for coming on. And as always, see you guys next time and bolt up.